Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Thank you for all the well wishes. I'm doing better after my COVID bout. My wife is doing better. My baby Annie, who also got COVID, is doing better. We're all doing okay here, but it was no joke. So mask up, stay safe out there. Not something I would recommend if you can avoid getting it. Rob and I are back at it for a weekly chat. We were stymied by COVID last week and then travel the week before that. So we had a lot to catch up on, and I actually really love this episode. It's a little bit longer than most, but we had a lot to talk about because a lot's going on in the world from a geopolitics and investment perspective. So without much more ado from me, as always, write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to learn more about cognitive investments, or if you have questions or suggestions about the podcast itself. If you have a minute, please consider leaving a rating for this podcast wherever you are listening to this podcast. A lot of you have done that. I'd love to get to 100 by the end of the year. For some frame of reference, we're around 65 right now. So it takes 2 seconds of your time. It's immensely helpful for us, helps the algorithm, help other folks discover this podcast. Also, share it with your friends if you like it. That's also a great way to support us too. So enough glad handing for me. Let's get to Rob. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Rob, it's been, 3 weeks since we got to do this normally. I missed you, man. How's it going?
Well, it feels like quite a long time, but good to be back in a new routine here.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen each other since then. We just haven't had a chance to sit down and actually do the podcast. And it's always a little bit intimidating because, I had COVID, I was traveling, you were moving, across the Atlantic, and the world goes on without you. Like you think it's gonna, like everything's gonna fall off a cliff, and then you're away for 3 weeks, and it's basically the same as where it was when you got there. So that's where we are. We're gonna hit 4 kind of key things in the podcast today. So we're gonna start with what started the week was this Russia grain deal. We're going to do some U.S.-China analysis and then talk about Brazil and Turkey because big developments there both. And then we'll talk a little shop and see where our nerdiness gets us. So I guess I'll just lead off the way and start with the week started off a little bit scary because apparently over last weekend, it looks like, I don't know if it was, I don't think Ukraine has claimed credit for it. The Russians are certainly accusing Ukraine of having attacked their naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea, which, if true, that's a big deal. That's Ukraine showing you, hey, we're not just going to, stalemate the Russians in eastern Ukraine. We're going to go after what they took in 2014. We're going to take a naval base in the Black Sea. I mean, that's a muscle flex if ever there was one. And Russia responded by pulling out of this grain deal that was negotiated by Turkey and that has succeeded in opening up Ukrainian grain exports to the world. You saw wheat prices spike again, corn prices, everybody was afraid. And then something really interesting happened. The Ukrainians kept exporting. They didn't really care. And Erdogan apparently called Putin on the phone and was browbeating him into, hey, this is not cool. You don't want to do this. All these developing market economies that are happy to see the grain deal go and happy to see grain exports flowing. I think maybe behind the scenes, they were putting some pressure on Russia too. So by Tuesday or Wednesday, actually by Wednesday morning, because I had to change some text in an analysis that I did, Russia did an about face. They said, just kidding. We're actually back in the grain deal. We're not going to do anything. And the reason I bring this up, it's 2 reasons. First of all, quite a shift just in a couple days. We went from, oh God, are we going back to the agricultural commodity price spike that we had in February and March? That didn't end up happening. But then another thing is, I think this war has gotten normalized, especially in the West. And I don't think we should normalize this slow motion collapse of at least Russian geopolitical influence and maybe the Russian government in the long term. You and I were just chatting beforehand. I'm thinking very, very strongly about what that means and who's going to benefit from that. So while most everybody else is focused on the European energy crisis, the things that we're continuing to see out of the Russia-Ukraine war and Russian weakness, my eye is on places like Poland. My eye is on places like Central and Eastern Europe, where people are generally bearish for a lot of good reasons in the short term. But, if Russia loses this conflict, if we live in a world where Ukraine can spank Russia in Crimea, we live in a world where Eastern Europe and the Balkans is a very, very interesting opportunity and is priced very, very low right now. So I don't know. Maybe we start there. How are you seeing it from your end?
Well, I'd love for you to walk us through that. So, if Russian power and influence really wanes and they're consumed with internal problems, how do you see that from the European Union standpoint in terms of Poland, Ukraine itself, the Baltics? How do they change in terms of their relationship with the EU?
So I think there's a couple, and I don't think all of Europe is created equal there. So we kind of have to divide it into different buckets. So if you're the Baltics, or if you're Poland, if Russia is so weak that it doesn't pose a meaningful threat to you, suddenly you have a level of security that you haven't really had at any time in the last century or two, at least. I mean, you really have to go back hundreds of years to where these countries felt secure and were actually the ones that were pushing against Russia. I mean, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest country in Europe, I think in the 17th century. I think I have that right. I haven't looked very closely I'm a little rusty on my 17th century Polish-Lithuanian history. But that's generally a time where those countries do well, and if they're not so much worried about security, they can think about building the economy or have more optimism for the future. Maybe their demographics get a boost because there's more migration there from Russia, or maybe people are willing to have more children because they're more optimistic about the future. So that's what it means for those. For Germany, I get that it's bad for Germany in the short term because Germany bet on cheaper access to Russian natural gas. Like, that was the thing they wanted to do. But go back to Germany's grand strategy since it reunified under Otto von Bismarck in the late 1800s. It has all been about expansion east. They want to take over, and there were a lot of different ideological ways to describe it. Lebensraum for the Nazis. It's the European Union and trade and all that other stuff now. But it's all about expanding east. The Germans want to sell their products into the Russian market. They want those Russian workers to be the next generation of cheap labor for German goods so that they can build those factories out there and then export abroad. I feel like every single major German leader going back to Bismarck has been trying to do that. So if Russia's just going to collapse on itself, like, once Germany figures out the energy situation, and it'll take them some time to do that. I don't mean to what's the opposite of exaggerate? I don't mean to downplay the level of change that has to happen in the next 2 years and the amount of capital that Germany is going to have to spend to get through this. But if Russia's weak at the end of that, well, they're talking about integrating Ukraine into the EU already. They don't have to worry about Russia calling foul because apparently Russia can't do anything. That's some of the most productive, awesome part of the Russian sphere of influence anyway. And then maybe you can start moving further into Russia if you want, and from a position of strength. So in some ways, like, Germany is backing into the thing that it always wanted without having to send a Panzer tank anywhere. Ironically, it's France and some of these other Western European countries that never had to be that concerned about Moscow. They really just wanted the cheap commodities. So they were always interested in better relations with Russia and telling the Poles and the Baltic countries, hey, don't worry so much. It's fine. For them, I think they have the luxury of being agnostic here because, yes, they get higher energy prices, but it really doesn't matter to them so much in the end. So to make a long story short, if Russia's weaker, Eastern Europe should feel more secure and can focus more on the future. It should be a boon to Germany. And Western Europe, it's not that big of a deal. But maybe if you take that schism between West and East, where they don't have to fight over whether Russia's a threat anymore, maybe you take away one impediment to further European unity, so they can go squabble about something else rather than about who has kind of Moscow right. So that's the model, or the analytical thesis I'm toying with right now.
The other thing I'm thinking about that you didn't mention is, what is the potential impact of a Ukrainian rebuild after, the bulk of the fighting is over? I mean, people are talking about a Marshall Plan of sorts for Ukraine. The amount of steel being bandied about, numbers as far as what they would need, is kind of off the charts. like you need supply chains to bring that stuff into the country. It's very remote. I have to imagine that Poland, Hungary are going to be well positioned to benefit from that rebuild, right?
Tremendously. I mean, and this is one of the reasons I'm so hot to trot about Poland, but it's great on a number of different levels, because if Russia's weak and Ukraine gets to export its agricultural commodities abroad, prices for agricultural commodities are up, and we think they're going to remain elevated. So Ukraine will have some capital here to throw into the system. It's not just going to be them. You already have Polish companies lining up saying, we are ready to rebuild Ukraine just about any time you want. If you were the European Union, might be I don't think this is going to happen. I'm exaggerating for effect here, but what if they decided to issue some euro debt to go ahead and rebuild Ukraine, and have some of these companies in Germany or Central Europe that are struggling so much right now? Well, what if you give them some fiscal incentive to go into Ukraine and actually help rebuild there? And then the other part of this is demographics, and this is another reason why Poland interests me so much, because there are a lot of close ties there, linguistically, culturally, historically. Excuse me. I think something like I think it's close to 4 million Ukrainian refugees are in Poland right now. So a lot of Eastern Europe, you've had really, really low fertility rates, even relative to all of the European continent. If suddenly you're also getting a lot of Ukrainians who have gone to those countries and are going to stay maybe in those countries and help rebuild back home, that's all good too. The last thing I would say, and this is, I don't think this has been talked about very much. Ukraine was not, like in 2014, even before the war, there are pro-Russian factions in Ukraine, and Ukraine has oligarchs of its own. And we're all very, I count myself among those who admire what the Ukrainians are doing in defending their homeland. It was a very, very corrupt state. It wasn't exactly a place where you knew where capital was going to be allocated or where you could trust rule of law and things like that. This war has probably obliterated at least some of that, because the pro-Russia factions have been completely delegitimized, and Zelensky now has the status of a hero. So he goes from, having to beg for scraps from the IMF and beg for defense here, and he's got these oligarchs that he's having to work with at home. He really might have a moment here if he can get the war over on terms that are favorable to Ukraine, to reshape the Ukrainian state in a way that would have not been possible unless you had this kind of cataclysmic conflict. So for all of those reasons, I think you're on the money. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity waiting there. And it's still a big if, like Russia's still there, there's still troops on the ground, they're still conscripting folks and throwing them into the meat grinder. They apparently are importing missiles from the Iranians. They're that desperate, but they're still fighting. And the Russian population doesn't seem ready to revolt against Putin. So it's not a foregone conclusion. We also have to think about, is the West going to continue to export weapons to Ukraine? We've been exporting sort of leftover weapons we didn't use during the Cold War so far. Well, what if we actually have to start producing new weapons for them because they've already used a bunch in the conflict so far? Are we really willing to foot the bill? So none of it is a sure thing. But if we get that sort of Ukraine victory narrative starts to come out, and Russia really does have to tuck tail and reach some kind of agreement, or worst case scenario falls apart, those are the pieces that make me feel good.
And we had shared internally this Tim Snyder analysis, which was very good about
really good.
The competing factions within Russia, and how certain figures like Kadyrov and I forget the name of the other gentleman who runs the...
I forget it too, but he's a Wagner Group guy.
Yeah, the Wagner Group
Great guy.
Yeah. Lovely people, all of them. How they were seemingly positioning to focus more on the home front and kind of throwing the conscripts into the heat in order to take away their own troops. How much credence do you give to that? What do you think about that analysis? Is that kind of the base case as far as the way to think about what's likely to play out, or is that not convincing for some reason?
Well, first, before I answer that question, I'll just say I was looking at the podcast data yesterday, and we had, I believe, 24 downloads in Russia from our last podcast. So Russian listeners, if you're out there and you feel confident enough, shoot me an email at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to tell me if my finger is on the pulse here in your country correctly, because I don't feel like I'm losing my access to information in Russia and understanding kind of what the psyche is on the ground there. And I'd be curious if you're listening to this and they're like, oh, these are just some Western assholes who are insulting our great Russian leaders and entrepreneurs who create these mercenary groups. But anyway, I thought the Snyder piece was excellent. The Snyder piece was actually the thing that caused me to stand up straight in my chair and say, oh, like Ukraine might actually be able to win this war. I need to shift away from watching, the back and forth on the battlefield and take a real step back here and think about kind of the long-term trajectory for Russia. So Snyder picked a very difficult task for himself. He's trying to imagine scenarios for what happens to Russia in the next 2 to 5 years. And I think he does a good job of articulating a very realistic scenario of what a Russian state collapse could look like. That's obviously a spectrum of possibility that has to be built out a little bit more. So I don't know if it's going to look exactly the way that he said, but I haven't talked to the guy and I don't know him personally, but I would bet that if you asked him that question point blank, he would tell you the goal of that scenario was to shake out the cobwebs in our mind and have a reset, not to say this is exactly how it's going to happen. And at least for me personally, he did that. I would credit that piece with really changing my focus on how to think about this war from very tactical to, okay, like what does this mean for the next 5 years? What does it look like if Putin is gone or if Moscow isn't a major global player, generally speaking? All right, moving on from there, I thought we might turn now and we might stick with this topic for a little while before turning to Brazil and Turkey. And you actually framed it this way, Rob, and it was really helpful for me. So I thought it'd be a good way to sink our teeth into what's going on. You've got a real dichotomy between what's happening with the U.S. economy and what's happening with the Chinese economy. And you were talking before we got on the podcast about how the price of oil is actually an interesting litmus test or indicator for what's going on in sort of the differing paths of those economies. So maybe lay that out and we can kind of dive in a little bit to both of those and break it apart.
Well, the best way to do that is to look at the numbers, I think. So the US consumes about 19 million barrels of oil per day, and China consumes about 14 million. So according to the latest data, Chinese consumption of oil is down something like 20% because of the COVID lockdowns, which brings you back to about 11 million barrels of oil per day. The flip side of that is in the US, oil demand is way higher than normal because of the travel boom, because of the general services and economic sort of strength that we're seeing. So Valero came out this week and said that currently demand for diesel fuel, for example, is up 32% from where it was pre-COVID because of trucking and everything going on. So if you really run the numbers, it's kind of a dead heat. China represents about 3 million of demand destruction. The US, about 3 million of extra demand, all relative